All right, welcome students. I am super thrilled to have Sam Beck with us, who you're about to learn is an MSU grad. He's going to tell you about his experience in MSU and since he graduated, what he's been up to. We know each other through the Denver IIA chapter, Institute of Internal Auditors chapter. You know this by now since you have maybe even attended an event by now. But Sam helped us on the board last year with membership, trying to get engagement up, and part of that includes the student membership. So Sam, I'm going to let you introduce yourself further to the students, and then I'm thrilled to talk to you about planning and engagement today.
Yeah, thanks for having me today, Joe, or I don't know if it's Professor Irvin, but
Professor Joe is what they call me. So.
all right, Professor Joe. I appreciate you giving me the chance to talk today, and thanks everybody for joining or for watching this interview here. So my name is Sam Beck. I'm a managing consultant with the internal audit practice here at Forvis. I'll give you a little bit of my story of how I got there. It started at CU Boulder. So I got my undergrad degree at CU Boulder in economics. From there, I went to work at a firm that sold life insurance and did some kind of personal financial planning. I worked there for about 5 years, and by the end of it, I absolutely hated it. It was very sales heavy. I was really bad at sales. And I did that for a while, and I kind of decided that I wanted to make a career change so I could maybe try to sell my time and expertise instead of these crazy financial products that were really difficult to understand. So from there, I did some research and found MSU Denver's Masters of Professional Accountancy program. While I was, working in life insurance, personal financial planning, I talked to a lot of CPAs. I was really impressed by the way that our clients talk to their CPAs and sought their CPAs guidance and expertise. So I was always really interested in accounting too. So that's kind of what drove me to want to go back to school and get my master's in accounting. So while I was at MSU Denver, I actually did my first internal audit engagement. As some of you may know, the university has an internal audit projects class where you actually get to do the university doesn't have their own internal audit function. They have the students do it. So my fun fact that I'll kind of go through is that class kind of changed the trajectory of my career going forward. I was interested in audit. I love debits and credits as much as the next person, but I really loved that internal auditors got to audit kind of everything. And I really enjoyed that class. It was really transformative for me. So my group and I actually did an internal audit over how MSU Denver tracks their graduation performance. So we got to interview a whole bunch of different departments, and we looked at some data and all these ways that they're tracking this graduation performance, and got to present that to the board of trustees. And it was a really great presentation. We got some great feedback and questions during that, and we were able to add a lot of value through that internal audit, and it made me really consider internal audit in the future as a potential career track after I got out of my master's degree. So while I was at MSU Denver, I found an internship opportunity through the MSU Denver Career Board for a small boutique internal audit firm here in the Denver area. There's only about 10 or so people at this firm doing outsourced internal audits and Sarbanes-Oxley engagements for their clients. So when I was interviewing for that internship, they really liked that I had experience in internal audit through MSU Denver. And that was really all they wanted to talk about. They didn't really care about my 5 years of professional experience working in an office and all these stories that I had kind of prepared for my interview. They really didn't care about that. They just wanted to know what I learned from doing that internal audit, which was a lot of things. I mean, when we started that internal audit, it was almost like if I had started it after doing it, I would have done things completely differently. It was that we learned that much through that process. They said that experience at MSU Denver really helped me stand out from other candidates, and I really think that it helped me land that internship, which is kind of why I'm at where I'm at right now. So to continue that story, that internship lasted about 7 months. It ended right before I graduated from the master's program. So actually, while I was walking for the MSU Denver graduation ceremony, I got a voicemail from the owner of that small boutique internal audit firm. and he said that he was merging that firm with a firm that was called BKD. It was a national firm, something like one of the 15 biggest national public accounting firms in the nation. So he said he was merging, and then he wanted me to come in as kind of a full-time new hire in there. They called it Enterprise Risk Solutions, but that's kind of their fancy word for internal audit practice. So I started there as an internal audit consultant. That'll be about 6 years ago in July of 2023. So been there for about 6 years. I've been working only in internal audit consulting during that entire time. And for about a year ago, BKD did a merger with a similarly sized firm called DHG. And since they merged firms, they wanted to get rid of the old names. And they changed their name to Forvis, which is a combination of forward and vision. So they kind of made up their own word, like FedEx. And so our internal audit practice more than doubled in size and geography as a result of that merger, which is really exciting for me. I get to work with all kinds of new people and different kinds of clients. And so I'm currently a manager in that internal audit practice. And we help clients with outsourced and co-sourced internal audit activities. A lot of our clients at the size of our firm are mid or small size clients. So they don't a lot of time have the staff or support that they need to complete everything on their internal audit plan, or they may not have an internal audit department at all. So they outsource that, or we call it co-sourcing, when they have an existing department, but they maybe need additional resources. Maybe they don't have the right amount of staff, or maybe they don't have the right expertise. So we will actually go in there and perform internal audits on behalf of the client. So it's kind of like a situation where I don't ever know who I'm working for. I work for Forvis, but then I'm actually an internal auditor at this company, and maybe you're working for their external auditors or doing something for their regulator. So it's a lot of that. I get really major benefits from working at a firm. I still think I'm early in my career, even though they call me a manager here, but I get exposure to a lot of different kinds of clients, a lot of different kinds of industries, a lot of internal audit professionals. I've kind of found everybody kind of does everything a little differently. So there's not one way to go through and do an internal audit. And I get a lot of exposure to different highly ranked individuals, both in internal audit and C-suite people at companies, to talk about risks and talk about areas that, where they're doing well, where they're not doing well. And I just get a lot of that from this career. So that's kind of what's kept me here at this firm, is I never get to do the same thing twice, and I never really know what's going to happen next. So it's kind of always exciting. And that's also something I want to impart to everybody is, a lot of times, sometimes they make it seem like, you're getting a professional accounting degree, you can go into audit or you can go into tax, but people think you need to do those for a long time before you can go into areas like consulting. But there's professional high-ranked consultants that need help too. So just like me, you can come straight out of college and work in consulting if you can identify those opportunities and identify where you can help people with what they're doing. So don't ever think that consulting is something that happens later. Sometimes you can be brought in straight out of college to do that. So that's kind of a little bit about myself. Is there anything else that you wanted to go on, Professor Joe?
I was going to say thank you, Sam, because literally that was probably the most valuable 10, I don't even know if that was how many minutes that was, but you just gave so many brilliant pointers and plugs, and thank you for that. I was writing things down. Obviously, thank you for plugging the master's program. A lot of the students watching this might be undergrad and thinking about it. So I think that's great. The career services at MSU, so C2 Hub, go see them. I think that's such a brilliant resource that we have. And then, of course, for plugging my internal audit projects class, which is now called Risk Assurance and Advisory Engagements. So much like you said, Enterprise Risk Solutions is what I believe it is. That what it's called now?
So they actually just changed it to internal audit. So we're called the internal audit practice. So it's easy for people to understand what we do.
Well, see, now we've been obviously talking about that at MSU, and we went with this kind of fancy. We wanted to use the word risk because I think that's a lot of what in the real world we're doing now. And the students actually watched a previous video with Peter Shell at DaVita, and they renamed their group Enterprise Risk Services, out of internal audit. So I think we're seeing a lot of that. So I liked that you mentioned that. And just your path. Thank you for sharing all of that. I think it shows that you can be non-traditional, you can go in and out of fields, and you can start over at any point in your life. And so even students watching this that think they want to do external audit or tax, just knowing that internal audit is another option out there one day is just great. So, and I also love that you talked about how you get to do what we're about to talk about at many different clients. So unlike some of the professionals that I've been having these interviews or conversations with, you know, you get a lot of exposure to planning, which is what we're going to talk about. So talk to us first about the importance of planning and engagement. And I'm sure this is even more critical for you coming in as almost like, I'm going to say an outsider, although you obviously do your research and you know about the clients that you're going to work on, but you probably have to do some pretty good planning when you start off. So kind of talk to us about why we spend time in this and why it's important.
Yeah, I kind of see planning as so critical that I don't like to differentiate it from tasks in an internal. I don't know if that's a good way to say it, but it's almost like planning should really be a part of everything you're doing, and it's not like its own separate task that you start with at the beginning. So
right, I mean, when we talk about planning, you're going to be maybe changing and looking at different things throughout. So when we talk about agile auditing, absolutely, that'll be a module, you know, down the road. The students will probably understand more of what that means. From a textbook perspective, they like to separate it out, right? But
yeah,
totally get what you're saying there. Yeah.
yeah. So when I started here, planning was we track our audits and our engagements very strictly when it comes to hours, because we're a consulting firm. So that's what we sell is our time. That's our inventory. We were usually given like 5 or 10% maybe of the budget should go towards planning activities. And when I think of planning activities, I'm thinking of what are you going to audit? How are you going to audit? Who are you going to talk to? What's going to be included? Those kind of things. That was usually something that was like, they gave us a little bit of time to write out a scope document, and that was it. As we've tried to move to more of that agile auditing way of thinking, which I've seen a lot of our new incoming directors and managing partners and that kind of thing that have come in here have been pushing towards, is we're now spending at a minimum something like 25% of our time on what I would call planning tasks. And I think that the importance of planning is so important because it's the whole overarching thing that we're trying to do here as internal auditors is to add value. And it is really impossible to add value if you don't take the time to learn and plan about where you can add value. So if you're coming into an internal audit for the first time, you can't just like brainstorm what areas you're going to audit and have a scope document developed without any input from who you're auditing or your client or your auditee. I'll kind of use those words interchangeably as I go. Sometimes you're auditing for a client, like if you work at a firm like I am, or if you're internal at a company, an internal audit department, your auditee is really your client, or your company you work for is kind of your client. So we really need to learn about these processes that you're auditing, the specific circumstances of the control environment of your auditee, and what they see as those risks. Like we talk about enterprise risk, we talk about that word risk a lot. So this means you have to have kind of many conversations to learn about policies, processes, procedures, and really most importantly, the risks of the areas that you're auditing before you can decide on what your scope should be or where you can add value. So that a lot of times we think, okay, we're going to do our planning, have our scope document, and then we're going to do our walkthroughs. I try to push that planning as far as I can. Like if I can push that planning until right before I issue the report, I think that's great. The MSU Denver audit that we did, we were assigned to do an audit on commencement spending. So the commencement is the graduation ceremony. So like we were going to do an audit over how they're budgeting and spending dollars towards that commencement ceremony. We went to the commencement committee, we had some interviews. We realized that we weren't going to add a whole lot of value in that process. So the VP in finance and my professor at the time pivoted us completely away from, and they said, as we were talking to everybody, they kept talking about, well, we keep hearing these stories about people who are close to graduating and not graduating, and we have no idea how many people that is, and how we're tracking that data. So we changed it from commencement spending to how they're tracking graduation performance overall, which is kind of a whole big objective of the university. And that was kind of where it really got interesting. And if we kept with commencement and just went down our area, we wouldn't really add much value. So that's kind of an example of how that planning can, in that scoping, can change as you go, and how important it is at adding value. I don't know if that answers that question or not.
It does completely. And what a great example of that. I know my university auditors last semester, were looking at university advancement, so the foundation and how they collect donations. And we started with, oh, let's look at monthly recurring payments and how we can get more of those. Well, that's a pretty automated process, and how they get those. And then, then we ended up on, pledges. And so it shifts, right? As you get it and you talk to them, you look at where the risks are. That is when that scope can change. And I think I just want to talk about that word scope for a little bit. I look at it as a lot of organizations, at least in my experience, they actually even write an objectives and a scope memo maybe at the beginning. Is that something that you all do, or what does that look like for your clients, or does it change per client? I think that's another kind of thing that can be very unique to wherever, whatever internal audit department you're looking at, right, or working with.
Yeah, and my experience is, I've heard different things from different people who come from working at a company versus working at a consulting firm. So since we work at a consulting firm, the lawyers and the risk management people at our firm want to make sure that everything we do is clearly stated and clearly agreed to before we do it. So what that means in practice from an internal audit point of view is we do have to have a scope memo. We call it like a scope letter or a scope document, that's separate from our engagement contract, that has all the terms and conditions that come with our engagement. This is like an add-on to that contract to say, okay, here's the objective. And the way that it flows is it goes objective, what we're planning to help the company with or the client with, and then the scope, what areas are included and excluded from our procedures, and then how we're going to achieve our objective, which is really the procedures. So it kind of flows through from objective, scope, and then to procedures is what our managing partner is expecting to see. And this becomes a contract document that gets reviewed and approved through our managing partner, and then also through our quality control team. So what they actually do is we have to get a signed scope letter. And again, I push that signed scope letter as far down the audit as I can, so I can try to capture as much areas that would add value to the client as possible in that scope. And then the procedures that will actually add value to, which often you don't understand until you've done a lot of walkthroughs and a lot of interviews. But we get that scope document, we get it signed by the client, and then what's on that scope document has to agree to what we say in our report that we did. So our report has a scope procedure section as well. And we call it EQR, engagement quality review. They come in, there's a separate person who's like director level who comes in and reviews our report and makes sure that the report wording, they review a lot of things, but one of the things they look for is the wording of those procedures in that report matches exactly to what our signed scope letter is. So it's really just a way that we can fence in what we're doing. One of the big risks that we're also trying to alleviate with that scope document is this concept of scope creep. A lot of times once you start interviewing folks, they kind of see you as like an internal audit therapist or something, where they just unload like their problems on you about whatever. So you'll get a lot of situations where people want to talk about something over here, but it's not necessarily in your scope. So having a clear document that's agreed to by the client on what we're auditing helps us prevent, situations where they're either trying to get us to go into a different area or just have problems with a different area. And maybe that should be something that's on a future audit or something else. But the scope document really helps us stay within our lines of what we've been agreed to do. And it's usually something that I reference often as we go through an audit. If you're assigned to something that's an internal audit, you should try to get that scope document, and it's kind of like your best friend that you keep next to you as you go through, and you're kind of asking yourself, is this something that's in our scope or outside of our scope, and kind of seeking help when needed to see if that scope should change or if what they're asking us to do is within the scope. It's always great to seek as much guidance as you can on that. So
yeah.
yes,
I
exactly.
love that you to introduce scope creep, because we definitely talk about that in performing an engagement next, because that is something that I know happens a lot. And even the new CFO at MSU told the student auditors that last semester, just watch out for scope creep. That was his one point of advice, I guess. So I love that you mentioned that. I think that how kind of structured you all do the scoping process is actually something probably a lot of internal audit departments could use some structure in how they do it. Honestly, I'd say, you know, to students, it's very similar in my experience when you're working for a company. It's just probably a little more laid back. It's not as contracty, right? You're not getting the legal department involved in those kind of things. So obviously with the professional services or consulting firms like Sam's at, that scope memo is critical to being paid at the end of the day and those kind of things. For us, we just want to make sure it's more of a it's rapport, right? It's trust. It's making sure what we put in that scoping and objectives memo is what we do at the end of the day, or we're very, very communicative about why we're changing it. And so I think, you know, in the internal audit, the traditional internal audit sense, that's probably the main difference there. It's more about communication than a contract change. So you mentioned, obviously, you like to do as many like kind of walkthroughs. I used to call them kickoff meetings, but I agree. A couple, even after that, you need to have some walkthroughs to really make sure you've got that scope in line and you know what you want to look at. What else do you use as a resource when you're planning? Just as an example, the students have already talked about risks and controls. So they've heard this term, a risk control matrix, which is sometimes I know what I've looked at in planning and engagement. I know I've done some surveys to gather some data at the beginning. Anything else come to your mind or examples that you could provide?
Yeah, a lot of times you're auditing something you have no idea about. So maybe it's I just did one for a healthcare company on exclusion screening. So it's this process where they screen their providers and their vendors to make sure that they haven't hit on any bad lists that make it so they can't get reimbursed from like Medicare or something. I had no idea what exclusion screening was when I started this. So doing some just Googling around to figure out what a regular kind of process like exclusion screening process looks like, what are typical best practices and controls, getting familiar with that. You don't need to be an expert on that process. And when you're with your auditees, you don't want to try to come across as an expert in anything either. They're the experts in the process, but we're experts in internal controls and performing these audits. So we can still add a lot of value. So just Googling around. I like to Google for existing audit reports that are out there. It's okay to cheat a little bit, especially with these government audits. We work with a lot of government clients. It's likely if a government is asking you to complete an audit of an area that there's a readily available audit report that's out there from the same area. Don't rely on those too much, but they can give you a lot of really good ideas for potential areas of scope and potential things that you can do. And then the resource that's their most important resource is the people you work with as you're getting started, asking a lot of questions for people that are really busy, like directors and managers. Challenge them to give you their insights on these processes. And then we have such a big firm here that there's usually like a subject matter expert. We just did one on leasing, like how this company that leases a bunch of their buildings out. So we actually had an expert in leasing out of one of our offices that we had a call with as we were planning to say, okay, what are some general controls and areas that we should be doing? I like Google alerts for your clients and for your auditees. You should always have Google alerts set up so that you know what's going on, big major news stories that are coming out in those areas. And then the big, I think, doing things like flowcharts are too. I think the risk and control matrices are great. Those are important things to do, but drawing out a flowchart of your processes, if they don't already have one, which a lot of times they won't. So once you kind of hear what their process is, how they expect things to be done, drawing out a flowchart, having them agree to it is a really good way to kind of find gaps and issues that are really prevalent when you see, okay, there's no controls here as this process moves, or I can see that this process is being completed all by one person and there's no segregation of duties. So flowcharts and infographics and all that stuff can be built into your report too. and kind of provide background. So developing those as you're going through these interviews and that kind of thing are great resources to use alongside their policies, procedures, and all those kinds of things I'll be reviewing before we get started with our engagement. And then data too, trying to do some data analytics if you can get data on transactions or whatever in the area that you're auditing, and start looking at trends, asking questions about trends, trying to identify we there's a whole nother data analytics class that's at MSU Denver that I could give a 30-minute plug on that data analytics class. I've used more stuff from that data analytics class in my career than any other class that I've, maybe internal audit projects is close, but yeah, that's kind of what I'll say is kind of resources I use when I start audits to try to figure out how to get started. It's also really important to understand your role in the engagement. A lot of times they won't spell that out for you. So understanding what your role is and maybe making sure to ask about that, as well as your expectations and your guidelines or deadlines, not guidelines, are really important things to ask for at the beginning of that engagement too.
Yeah, I love your full list. I mean, literally, you pretty much hit just the real world and the textbook definition of what planning is. Process mapping, so flow charting, definitely good. Data analytics, like you said, getting policies, procedures, any narratives that they already have around their process. I always ask auditors, I'll joke, like, what's the first step everybody does? It's typically ask for policies, procedures, or asking for like all of last year's data, right? So you can do some analytics and trends. So I think those are some common things I see. And you can see also as Sam's talking, all of this stuff that we do during planning, it's really going to start overlapping with performing, right? So we're about to, in the next module, talk about, okay, when do you really start performing? You really already started that. If you've gotten data analytics and you've gotten, done some sorting and pivot tables and you see some outliers, you might now know exactly what you're going to test, right? So it's really this preparation into the next step, if not already starting the next step, right? So I love that. Anything else you want to share with the students? You've given them some great advice already. I've been asking the professionals, if they could talk to their younger selves or back when they were in college, anything you would change or do differently. Anything else, Sam, on your side?
We talked about in the beginning, careers change. It's a journey to figure out what you want to do versus what you're good at, what you think you're good at, but versus what you're actually good at. All these things are really challenging as you explore where you want to go in your career. And like you said, you can always pivot, just like you can pivot your audit, your internal audit, you can always pivot what's going to happen in your career. And I don't know, just trying to figure out what that is as a journey. It's really difficult. So don't think that you need to have it all figured out. If you're an undergrad, don't feel pressure to be like, oh, I need to figure this out before I graduate. Try things out. Go do as many of these internal audit engagements as you can if this is something you're interested in. See what you like. And I also liked what you said about building trust. I think building trust is one of the most challenging things we can do, especially as young internal auditors, is to go into a process and have somebody that's been doing this for 30 years, actually audit them. And I think that's really challenging. And I think a big part about building trust is laying out what you're doing in this planning phase of making sure that the auditee knows what's going to happen, making sure that they know what the audit process is going to be. And then when you report findings, knowing that they won't be surprised about any of those findings because you've already discussed them with them. And that's one thing that I used to work with Charlie Wright, who's the chairperson of the IIA, or used to be the chairperson of the IIA Global. And his big thing that he said when he started engagements with clients is that he made this big speech about promises and how he doesn't promise his wife anything even, but he wanted to promise whoever he was auditing that there won't be any surprises once they get to the end of it. So that goes a big way towards making this more of a collaborative thing and less like a gotcha kind of audit, which you don't want to get clients to think that you're going to try to you're out to get them. So trying to build that trust and make sure they know the process, make sure they know they're going to get to review everything before it becomes part of your report, is a big part of building that trust and that collaborative environment for the audit to thrive in.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I've even said this on previous interviews, but transparency, right, is the word that just keeps coming to my mind. And transparency equals trust a lot of times, even if it's vulnerability that you're showing to a client, and, asking those questions that you might feel like are dumb questions. It's just being vulnerable and transparent to me. So, well, Sam, I greatly appreciate your time. I think you've imparted a lot of wisdom on the students, both personally and professionally. And thanks for joining us for this interview.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.